Ladies and gentlemen, let me ask you to be so kind, come inside, take your seats, because the last panel discussion is just about to start. Delivering humanitarian aid is not only about having enough resources, of course, it's crucial, but it's also about being flexible and about using new innovative ways of funding and effectively merging public and private resources. This will be the topic of our last panel discussion that I kindly invite you to listen to. And as an alternative, there is also our deep talk taking place at the same time on the second floor, where we will discuss Russia's war in Ukraine, and you will get a chance to hear precious testimonies from Ukrainian organizations working right in the field. So if this is something which might be of a greater interest to you, please don't hesitate, and you may also go and join our speakers, our guests at the deep talk. If you prefer to stay with us and talk about new ways of funding, you are very much welcomed. And let's get inspired from the guests of our last discussion panel, moderated by Jan Liska, Caritas.cz. Jan, the floor is yours.
So once again, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and distinguished guests of the panel. Let me first introduce myself. My name is Jan Liska. I work as institutional funding advisor for Caritas Czech Republic, part of Caritas family, and I, in my work, focus both on humanitarian aid and development cooperation funding. But in this panel, we will obviously talk exclusively about the humanitarian response. In my work, I also collaborate closely with different country offices Caritas Czech Republic has across the world. We do humanitarian aid in Ukraine and Syria. We do development cooperations projects in different countries of Eastern neighborhood. And we do nexus approach in Africa, in countries such as Zambia, where our focus is on sustainable livelihoods and climate change adaptation. Enough about me and my organization, but before I go and introduce the speakers on the panel, I wanted first to quickly set the scene and properly introduce the topic for this panel discussion. So, the panel is called Unlocking Efficiency Through Flexible and Innovative Funding. And so in this panel, with the panel speakers, and we hope also with you, the audience, we will try to cover the whole range of topics to do with institutional funding. We will discuss quality funding from European as well as national perspective, from donors, just as well as NGO point of view. We will talk about possible ways how to close ever-increasing funding gap, but we will also try to focus on positive and good practice examples from different countries of European Union and, of course, European Commission itself. For our discussion, there were really two departure points. Point de départ. The first one is Grand Bargain, a voluntary agreement of various donors, governments, United Nations agencies, and the non-governmental organizations that seek to make the humanitarian response system more efficient, responsive, and accountable. And the second point de départ was ever-increasing funding gap between emerging needs and resources available to address them. Let me give you some numbers first. By the end of 2023, 363 million people are projected to need humanitarian aid, 1 in every 22 people worldwide. These are 89 million people more than expected at the beginning of 2022. And despite this, the current figures of the United Nations Financial Tracking Service show that at the end of September, the global humanitarian appeal for 2023 was only funded by 32%, leaving a funding gap of $38 billion of US dollars. So, in order to change the dynamics and start closing the gap, we need to be innovative and use new approaches such as anticipatory action, and also bring new institutional players in the game. So we will talk about that, but before we do, let me introduce you to our distinguished speakers. Let me start with a lady to my left, Ruth Watson. First, Ruth represents Brussels-based ACT Alliance EU, a network of 12 relief and development organizations, part of Global ACT Alliance. Ruth is responsible for managing the humanitarian policy and advocacy and has more than 10 years of experience influencing and communicating with EU. She focuses on local-led humanitarian response, innovative models and trends in humanitarian funding. But she has double hat because she also represents Voice. She's a member of a Voice board. Voice is a European network of almost 100 NGOs that are engaged in humanitarian response across the world. Next to Ruth is Tomáš Bokor, who is a director of SlovakAid, a Slovak agency for international development cooperation that manages both humanitarian and development funding. He has previous experience of working for various Slovak and international institutions such as UNDP, as well as for a number of NGOs. He has equally a field experience from South Sudan and Iraq, where he worked on development and humanitarian projects. So good afternoon to you, Ruth. Good afternoon to you, Tomáš. And now let's switch online, where we have two other speakers. The first one is Ralf Südhoff. Ralf is a founding director of Center for Humanitarian Action, a Berlin-based think tank that engages in independent analysis and initiates the debate about humanitarian action and principles. Ralf heads the research project on linking German and European policy capacities. He focuses, among others, on Syrian crisis, nexus approach, humanitarian reform, and donors policies. He has previously worked for World Food Programme and World Health Organization. So good afternoon to you as well, Ralf.
Good afternoon.
And last but not least, on the panel we have Michael Keller, who represents DG ECHO, and he worked for almost 30 years in Brussels for different DGs, such as MARE and NR, but perhaps more importantly from our perspective, in NIR and in PA. And Michael has been DG's ECHO Deputy Director General for past 5 years. I would also like to say that between 2022 and 2023, for almost a year, Michael was also an Acting Director General. An interesting fact that I discovered about you, Michael, is that at the very beginning of your Brussels career, you started as a desk officer for Yemen and Iraq. And I would just like to finish by saying that from NGO perspective, we appreciate enormously your will to hold a continuous dialogue with us through Voice platform and your commitment to grand bargain, notably to the role of local partners in humanitarian response and quality funding for NGOs. So, good afternoon to you, Michael, and welcome to the panel to all of you once again.
Good afternoon to everybody in Bratislava.
And now that the introductions have been properly done, let's dive into the subject. We have approximately 45 minutes for the panel discussion before we will go to you, and we will be happy also to take your questions and be happy to answer them. So, because our time is limited, I will also ask the speakers on the panel to try to be concise in their answers. And first topic that I would like to address today is the topic of the quality funding. We will have different speakers taking a different angle on it, but I would like to start first with a European perspective. And so the first question would go to you, Michael. As signatory of Grand Bargain, DG ECHO has pledged to bring its multi-year funding to 30% by the end of 2023. So have you achieved that? And what are the other concrete steps that DG ECHO undertakes in order to increase the flexibility and non-earmarking of your funding? Over to you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Jan. And sorry that at this time I cannot be physically with you. I was there at the first forum last year, and I have very good memories. Hopefully next year there will be another occasion to be really with you. First, perhaps 2 or 3 words about the Grand Bargain, because I found to my surprise that the Slovak Republic is not yet a signatory to the Grand Bargain. Maybe I can use this occasion to beat the drum a little bit and to make some publicity, because obviously I cannot imagine that the Slovak Republic and also the civil society in Slovakia and in the other Visegrad countries wouldn't be wholeheartedly supporting the agenda of the Grand Bargain, such as more localization, more quality funding, innovative financial instruments, stronger accountability, and so forth. The Grand Bargain has just started in June, a new iteration, a new phase of its life. You have all the major players in the humanitarian sector in there, and it's actually the only kind of how should I say, body where you have absolutely all kinds of stakeholders in the humanitarian sector, from the biggest single donor, such as the United States, to nexus partners, such as the World Bank, for example, to even the representation of local responders and local NGOs. So I think it's an interesting body to speak about and agree about the ways to innovate. Now, one of the elements of innovation is indeed something which sounds quite banal, but in reality is a little bit difficult. And we deal with it in the Grand Bargain under the heading of quality funding. And that means to have more flexible and more long-termish approaches in the way how humanitarian aid works. We're all faced with the kind of perplex situation that in 80% of the cases where humanitarians operate today, we are dealing with protracted long-term conflicts. Ukraine is just one example. But also, as everybody is speaking about Gaza these days, we have humanitarian aid in Gaza already for 4 or 5 decades. The same thing is true for Syria. The same thing is true for Mali, for Yemen, for Afghanistan, for many conflict regions in the world. But the instruments that we're using, of course, are still very much short-term instruments, quick impact, that's excellent. But unfortunately, with a duration of only about 8 months, 12 months or something like that, which means that midterm, long-term planning in a situation where the needs are long-termish, so to say, is more difficult. Now, you're right, Jan, in the Grand Bargain, signatories have taken a commitment to move the share of their long-term contracts and programs up to 30%. But I think at this moment in time, only very few of the 66 signatories can probably boast that this has been achieved. As far as the European Commission is concerned, our Commissioner Janez Lenarčič has taken a commitment to increase from last year to this year by 30%. But there's a difference between having an overall score of 30% or increasing what you have by 30%. To be honest with you, as we are now looking into our books and we are in the process of performing a mapping exercise to see which kind of flexible funding instruments we have and how much this means for the 2023 and also the 2024 programming. But I believe that we will probably find that we have about 15% or maybe 20%, not yet 30% of long-term and flexible funding approaches. What is, however, important is the increase, that we are in a way on track with the development of long-term instruments. There we have to look at the kind of programs that we are financing. So far, in 2 areas, we already work quite regularly on the basis of at least 2 years, sometimes 3 years long contracts. And these areas are in particular education in emergencies, where clearly the needs are not restricted to short-term interventions. And the other one is disaster prevention, which of course becomes particularly topical now in the context of climate mitigation discussion and the discussion about the extension of the nexus from humanitarian to climate issues. But also when it comes to the kind of mainstream intervention, for example, in the area of food security, in the area of health, of water and sanitation and so forth, and also of protection, we have made an effort to go for longer term and for more flexible instruments. And there are basically 2 main instruments that we use in addition to the simple long contract. The 2 main instruments are, on the one hand, something which many donors and many partners know, the country-based pooled funds, that OCHA is operating, that usually the resident and the humanitarian coordinator is funding, or is operating, in the country. And at this moment in time, the European Commission supports country-based pool funds, for example, in Ukraine, in South Sudan, in Afghanistan, and in Venezuela. This leads to, let's say, a quite unique possibility to facilitate the quick and targeted release of funding. And we also have other tools for that, like our emergency toolbox, our rapid response mechanism, or, for example, the DRAF that is operated by the International Federation of the Red Cross. But in addition to that, we developed a new model of long-term partnerships, the so-called programmatic partnerships. And programmatic partnerships we have now with a number of UN bodies, with both branches of the Red Cross movement and with a number of international NGOs. These are contracts that can either cover a single country or a region, or they can have a thematic approach, like, for example, protection in sub-Saharan Africa, or disaster prevention, for example, in Asia. They are concluded usually with one partner organization. And as I say, they have a vision for at least 3 years of cooperation. For legal reasons, we still sign contracts for 1 year, but what we do at the beginning is that we send a letter to our partner, say, even if the contract is only for year one, we give you our kind of gentleman's parole that you will have also a contract in the year N+1, in the year N+2, as long as there is a European budget. But so far, we always have a European budget. So the partner can actually establish project or program infrastructure over 2 or 3 years, sign contracts with its staff for a longer period, and therefore come to economies of scale. We have seen that these programmatic partnerships, especially when they are concluded with NGOs, lead to a new quality of partnership, that indeed there is a dialogue. So it's not simply a donor-contractor relationship. It is a dialogue where both sides feel that they should look both in the strategy but also the tactics of program implementation. And of course, when such a program has a regional outreach, so not only one country but a number of countries, or a thematic or sectoral outreach, then it is very easy within such a program to adapt these programmatic partnerships to new challenges. For example, if you have something of that kind in Chad, and all of a sudden you have the influx of 400,000 South Sudanese refugees, of course we can very easily use the program also to cater for them. Or if you have something of the kind of a programmatic partnership in the health sector, and you have a new pandemic like COVID, you can use the program that you already have also to deal, for example, with COVID response, from vaccination to the provision of protective equipment, for example. So these new forms of program, I avoid the word project here, are actually quite satisfactory, and therefore we are rolling them out at a much larger scale. So we're increasing from year to year and respond in that to a demand by partners. But, and I would like to conclude with that, what we see, of course, is that quality funding and flexible funding must mean more than simply a donor providing long-term funding. It needs to be a two-way road. Also, the implementing partner cannot simply continue to operate as he or she would have operated before. There needs to be a much more intensive dialogue throughout the rollout period of such a program. There needs to be something like a mentality whereby both the donor and the implementing partner work together on the steering of the program and adapt it to new challenges. And there needs also, I think, a greater sensitivity on the side of the implementing partner for the visibility and the accountability constraints of the donor. So if a multi-annual approach means that I give you money and after 3 years you send me a report and tell me I performed beautiful work, then this is not good enough. Because in the meantime, my public, my parliament, in the case of the European Union, also my member states will ask me, what are you doing with all this money? What is happening? Are you responding to the latest crisis? Does it serve our interest? are we still sure that the program is on the right track? So there needs to be a much more flexible exchange on all these aspects, from accountability to visibility to information about new challenges and so forth. And that means there needs to be a different relationship between the donor and the implementing partner. But once that is in place, our experience with programmatic partnerships is outright positive, and therefore we increase the share of such programs as part of the portfolio of our overall funding. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Michael, for a very complete answer and for raising the point that quality funding is at the same time, to a great extent, about quality communication from both sides. So the second question goes to you, Ralph. It is still on quality funding, and I would like to address with you two specific points. So the first point is a project-based versus program-based funding. We all know that the project-based funding constitutes the majority of the current funding, and it poses a number of constraints. It is short-term, and in contrast to it, the program-based funding has a much more important margin for flexible reaction to changing circumstances, changing priorities, security settings, etc., etc. Could you please elaborate on that? So that was the first point, and I will directly ask the second one, which is related to the locally led humanitarian response. We of course know that the local organizations, and that was also something that we discussed here in the morning, need to play really a central part in the humanitarian response, and I would like to ask your opinion about that. Over to you, and please try to be concise.
Well, many thanks. Good afternoon, everybody. Many thanks for having me. I hope you can hear me loud and clear. Many thanks for inviting our center, our think tank, which is Germany's leading think tank on humanitarian action. Really happy to be with you, so I also can only attend online and look forward to come next year, even as a participant. Many thanks for the very important questions. Very happy to build on, especially what Michael said. I mean, Michael touched already very comprehensively already the issue also of program funding, which is indeed very interesting. But maybe underlining also another point Michael made on the overall setup and idea of the grand bargain, because that really underlines, from my view, why such a technically sounding issue like flexible funding, quality funding, is really of crucial importance for saving lives and really for an effective humanitarian aid. Because often forgotten is that 2016, when the Grand Bargain was started at the World Humanitarian Summit, it was indeed meant as a bargain. It's not just a donor issue. We keep talking for good reasons about donor policies, but it's a bargain between two sides, and especially between aid agencies and the donors, in the sense to make a deal. We need far more flexible funding. We need more agility by the aid agencies, claiming that for good reasons. We have more and more shocks these days. The era is over that you have this classic onset emergency, an earthquake, you go in with humanitarian aid, then you move on to reconstruction, then the development actors take over, and after this linear period, we move out, hopefully, and head over back to the host government. It's much more about shocks, about a lot of back and forth. It's much more about onset weather emergencies, which come at a much larger scale, 4 times more often than a few decades ago. And as Michael mentioned, we have protracted conflicts which are far higher in number, and also in the length and in the period we need to deal with them. And by that also we have always very volatile front lines, we have fighting coming up. So we need a lot of scope, much more than in the past even, to adjust programs, to adjust the response by all actors, and to get this done in a setting which in the past has been characterized by a lot of earmarking, by a lot of micromanaging by most donors, especially the top ones. And that was the background to make a deal. Well, we need an agreement. We need more flexible funding, more flexibility on the agency side. But at the same time, we need accountability. We need transparency. What do you do with the funds? And how do you decide to invest them? And in which way is this efficient and effective? and we can report that back to the stakeholders like the parliament and the taxpayers. 7 years later, and that's why the flexibility part of this deal is so central, and it's so important and so much appreciated that you focus on this one in this session. 7 years later, progress is unfortunately very limited on both sides, one must say. Also, the commitments of NGOs, of UN agencies to the grand bargain, the fulfillment on various fronts is mixed, let's say, and it's also mixed, for example, in terms of accountability, on having even data on it. You mentioned already the localization issue. A bit more as a side note, we have just made an assessment of the top 5 INGOs, we as a center, and the top 5 UN agencies, how they have delivered on on funding local actors as promised with at least 25%. And most of the NGOs we ask don't even have data on it, let alone achieve this objective. So it's really also something where the implementing agencies need to do their homework from our view, unfortunately still. But today, I mean, flexible funding is more about donors, and coming back to the donor funding, indeed, there is a similar trend, and the homework of key players isn't really done, just the opposite even. Michael mentioned already struggling on top donors stepping up, but not reaching the 30% goal yet. It's very similar with Germany, who has ups and downs in flexible funding. And it's overall, for example, a tendency that even UNHCR, for example, though UN agencies are rather characterized as being fairly flexibly funded, UNHCR, for example, is reporting that the flexible funding they receive has decreased from the years before the grand bargain from about 50+% to the last figure we heard was 28%. So really a trend going in the wrong direction and not step by step in the right one. Having said that, you mentioned already tools and approaches which are really promising, and we don't want to depress each other, and there's no reason for it from my view. And I think there are basically 3, and I can touch really quickly on them because the program one Michael already elaborated on very well from my view. Program funding versus project-based funding, something Germany has piloted also years ago, and ECHO is picking it up, and some other donors. Or I don't even know who's been the lead, Michael, sorry for prioritizing Germany on the timeline. But it's really an interesting approach because it tries to find the right balance between we need accountability, what you do with the funding, but we don't need necessarily it on the micromanagement project basis. We fund the program, for example, for a region, for the Chad, for the Sahel, but we leave it to the organizations who are on the ground, who know what they are doing, the ones who we trust, to decide where they want to invest the funds specifically. And we expect from a retrospective, proactive reporting, accountability, and reports which are really substantial, so we can, in the audiences we have to report to, we can justify why we don't give these billions for countries which are, for example, not part of the European Union, and why we do fulfill our commitment by doing so in an effective and efficient way. Unfortunately, it's not really scaled by most sides. It's great news that ECHO is scaling it more and more. On the German side, it's coming more like to a halt, stagnating. It's not yet the role model for all partnerships. What we would hope for, and the same for other EU member states, and would be great if especially countries like SlovakAid could play a role model in this as well, and demonstrating that's not something which is only specific to the top donors like Germany or ECHO. Just quickly touching on another one, multi-year funding. Germany has been really scaling that. And Michael mentioned that there are limits by budget regulation, which is very often, of course, a limit of various donors. At the same time, Germany has a very similar challenge due to very strict budget regulations. But even the amounts they have committed for the years to come, for example, confirming that for Syria response, any UN agency or an NGO will get a basic funding line also in the year to come, because we all know the crisis will be ongoing. for Ukraine in 2024, you can be sure you have a basic funding line, so you also don't have to sack, for example, local staff, because contracts are expiring and early in the year you don't have funds to pay them, etc. So that's of great help and has been very successfully scaled, even on this basic scale, which is, as we hear, very helpful from the practitioner side. And the final point, anticipatory action, something which from our view, but I'm sure Ruth will touch on that one as well. That's really something which can also be very efficient, very effective, because you have, you have funds on hand ahead of a crisis, and you can already invest and can already program and provide assistance to people expecting a flood, expecting a drought, and not intervene much too late, or when it's very challenging by averages, etc., then the crisis is already unfolding. And it's also a question of being more just and more accountable on the donor side, because the typical way of modeling anticipatory action is to fix and agree on very, very precise conditions when the funds will be released. If there's a certain amount of rainfall in a given country, there will be funds released to the farmers so they can get ready and prepare. And that's, of course, a totally different story to a charity approach. Whenever a crisis are unfolding, there is an appeal and the machinery is looking into it and might start slowly, and nobody can act before the first funds are pledged, etc., to put it very simply. So I think these three examples of program versus project-based funding, multi-year funding, even on a basic level, and anticipatory action can really be great models to expand flexibility, which would be much needed for moving humanitarian reform and meeting the escalating needs and reaching people in need. And I leave it with that. Many thanks for allowing me to speak for a bit too long, I'm afraid.
Yes, a little too long, and I think in next round, if you have the floor, I would ask you to be more concise. But thank you very much for your insightful answer and for the examples that you were given. And now I would like to turn to you, Ruth, but still stay on the subject of the quality funding. You in this panel, you represent non-governmental sector. So I wanted to give you a possibility to build on what Michael and what Ralph have already said, and give us the NGO perspective on quality funding. Why is it so important to us?
Okay, thank you very much for the invitation to be here from the Ambrela Forum, and for hosting us, Jan. And thank you for the input so far, which I will, in fact, build on. I will try not to duplicate some of the really insightful information already shared. So just to first build on your points on multi-year funding, which has already been discussed in quite a lot of depth. You know, a bit later in this conversation, we will talk about some models of flexible funding in rapid response mechanisms from 3 member states. And just now, I'll just mention those member states that we'll discuss: Irish Aid, the Dutch Relief Alliance with the Dutch MFEA, and Danida. And I think the lessons which come from the models in terms of their strategic partnerships approach and their programmatic approach that you've just been discussing on the German context and the EU context gives some important lessons both for the positives and challenges that we can think about moving forward in this discussion. And so firstly, a real positive in that kind of long term, whether it's 4-year partnerships built with a group of NGO partners or between 3 and 5 years, is it allows the space and time for NGOs, both international, the partners of the member states, but also local actors with whom we partner, to develop the mechanisms and structures and to then be able to develop positioning and collaboration on the best programmatic design to meet the needs in country. So I'll just give one brief example of that. The Dutch Relief Alliance mechanisms involve both a steering committee in the Netherlands as well as a local advisory committee, and representatives from both are in constant regular advocacy discussions and technical discussions with the Dutch MFA. So as Michael hinted to, there are needs for dialogue. Do those need to be intense and heavy? Not necessarily. What we hear reported from these longer-term strategic approaches is that they allow the space for NGOs, as Ralph mentioned, to have the space and time to decide strategically where to allocate funding, to avoid, therefore, some of the impact of politicized or mediatized attention, which in some ways is inevitable when new crises arrive, but requires careful planning. And as I've just mentioned, it's really crucial in terms of locally led response. And to just touch on a challenge in relation to that, which the Dutch Relief Alliance are currently looking at, it's very easy for us to say, okay, we have this multi-year fund, so therefore we are able to be locally led. The intent has to be there for the implementation to also result. And what I mean by that is we can say, okay, we're working with our pre-selected local partners and therefore we are locally led. But the reality of local leadership and being responsive and locally led goes further than an intention to maintain power and resources and decision-making essentially in the hands of international organizations and us as donors. We're looking for complementary action where we genuinely make the shifts. So the Dutch Relief Alliance are looking at how in their next round of their programmatic approach, they can actually kind of adjust some of the structures of the advisory committee approach and the programming design to make sure that they're not just working with a pre-selected group of partners, but actually kind of mapping and engaging much more broadly with the organizations who are in the correct context at the right time. So the second thing to share is a challenge both to the programmatic partnerships that Michael's discussed, as well as across the board of the strategic programmatic partnership approaches. The inherent challenge we still have is that it meets a small number of INGOs. So our Danish member of Act Alliance EU very frankly shared a question of self-reflection, which is, are we essentially feeding the monsters with these kind of programmatic approaches? And her reflection was, no, this is a mechanism which allows many of those organizations with capacities to be able to move forward in equitable and in effective implementation. But there is an important question for smaller organizations: what amount of funding is remaining, and how can they be effectively included and at the level that promoting diverse civil society requires. And the third aspect, which I would just like to come back to, we had some really interesting panels earlier looking at Ukraine and then the Horn of Africa. And the overarching topic of this discussion is the humanitarian funding gap. So something which we have to consider regardless of the strengths of the programmatic multi-year financing approaches is the funding pot, and being careful to analyse at the political level, where is the funding going? And even though these mechanisms to a large degree are protected, they are not protected fully against approaches which shift towards securitization or diversion of funding, particularly in relation to the Ukraine situation of development financing. But the overall impact of the Ukraine situation for both development and humanitarian funding has been something high on the agenda of NGOs to monitor and to see what does this mean for ongoing civil society engagement. We can't ignore these political conversations when we also look at the technical details of what programmatic responses mean. And a final point on that is to say on the humanitarian side, there's a recent UN coordination decision to mandate NGOs and partners to submit humanitarian response plans, which heavily prioritise and ruthlessly cut as far as possible to meet the funding gap. And while the rationale is clear, the implications and the possible consequences for the decisions by member states and the approaches that we take to funding are potentially huge. And as we're going to move on, I think we have to be very clear about how we're going to maintain investment in resilience, investment in anticipatory action, and in locally led response, all of which require upfront financing, even for longer term savings.
So thank you very much, Ruth, for your answer. And as you can see in the public, we have very enthusiastic and knowledgeable speakers on the panel who have a lot to share. I will keep asking for concise responses if you want to have more questions on this panel. And with that, I would like now to take a look at the quality funding from the national perspective. And I would like to turn to you, Tomáš. Because SlovakAid cannot obviously compete with large donors in terms of funding volumes, but it can build its comparative advantage by being quick and flexible. So what are SlovakAid strategies in terms of flexibility and rapid response mechanism? And also, does SlovakAid possess matching fund tool that could help to co-fund bigger European projects? If so, how does it work? And if not, are they in the pipeline, perhaps with other improvements to your funding system? Over to you.
Thank you very much for the question, Jan. Or actually, let's say two questions. I will try to be concise, but I hope I will not be discriminated against in terms of.
No, in the first round, you can speak as much as you want, but in the next round, 1 minute only.
Yeah, thank you very much. So, in terms of flexible funding, yes, we do understand that the pot that we have available is smaller, and we do need to cook something nice with a little bit less than the large donors. We are hearing the same from OECD, who is saying, well, yes, your funding is smaller in terms of absolute numbers, and therefore you need to be focused, more efficient and flexible. So it puts a little bit of pressure on us. And yes, we are having constant discussions when it comes to humanitarian aid that, well, and we have this saying in Slovak, the one who gives fast gives twice. So this is kind of a popular proverb that we are trying to follow. And to be honest, and this is an interesting perspective that comes on my side, because until 2 years ago I was in NGO world, and now I'm 2 years into a world of bureaucrats. And to be honest, flexibility is something that we all dream of. But once you put on a hat of a bureaucrat and you start dealing with public money, it's a completely different universe. I mean, there are examples. We have a law on the rules of public budget, and there are so many safeguards to make sure that the money is not lost, that is used efficiently and for the right purpose. That really kind of ties our hands, and these are kind of rules that apply to all the funding, all the grants that the government of Slovakia disburses to whoever, home and abroad. So one thing that we have to really and we will try to pursue is to kind of build sort of a small caveat within the funding and make sort of effective and meaningful changes in the general legal landscape in Slovakia that would allow the humanitarian funding to maintain sort of a specialized space. Because honestly, if you take the general rules on humanitarian funding, it is not going to be flexible. I can guarantee you that. You need to, for example, receive certificate from the employment inspectorate, and it takes a month to get it. Just a simple, specific example. So one thing that really we will be looking at, and we'll be trying to work within the new government on sort of the boring bureaucratic rules and how to make them different for humanitarian for the sake of flexibility. And it's not easy, I can tell you that. You pick up a phone, you call the Ministry of Finance and ask them that you want to change a certain rule on how you give grants. They're going to be, take a deep breath and then explain how it's not possible. But this is a discussion that we will have to have. And it's not an easy one, but it's the one we will have to have. So this is not something very sexy and attractive, but something that needs to be done. That's one of the challenges. But what we can do at the moment, with the rules that we have, is something that Michael already mentioned, for example, which is the programmatic partnerships. So to have some of the recipient organizations that jump through all the bureaucratic hoops and can receive multi-year funding, as was mentioned also, for example, by Ruth. So this is something we already set down with Ambrela. It is not an easy task, but it's something that we can do within the current legislative landscape to have someone in a way certified, have a multi-year funding, and when the crisis hits, we have someone available to respond very quickly because they've already been certified, they have the contract with the ministry, and they can move very fast. So this is something that takes a little bit less effort, but nevertheless, it is still a little bit of a way to go. But definitely programmatic partnerships, multi-year financing is something that we believe is a good way to go within the current situation in Slovakia. In terms of matching funding, the answer is very brief. At the moment, we do not have the mechanism. We tried for Ethiopia. The only thing that we do, and for example, we are going to be doing it very, very soon, is match the funding, for example, for Ukraine. There is an initiative that raised 750,000 euros for humanitarian demining, and the Slovak government is seeking way how to complement that, to double that funding. But these are sort of very specific ad hoc sort of situations. So at the moment, we don't have a sort of a system in place for the match funding, I'm sorry to say.
Don't be sorry. Thank you very much for your response. And I think there are actually many things when I was listening to you that must resonate between you and between Michael, because both of you represent donor organizations, and I think that we all wish for a flexible, quick, multi-year funding. But I mean, we all also understand that in reality, it's much harder, and we just hope that we can take it forward as quick as possible. But this being said, I would like to turn back to you now, Ruth, because I think that you can provide us with some good practice examples from different EU member countries where this flexible funding is already available. Over to you.
Thank you very much. Hello? Does this work? Great. So thank you, and I think I've been asked the question so that I can speak to you. So no, just that's tongue-in-cheek, but I'm just going to share then some short points for the interest of time on, like I said before, models from Irish Aid and Danida DERF, which is, I hope it's Disaster Emergency Relief Fund. Yeah, and I've already touched a bit on the Dutch Relief Alliance, but the common positives in terms of rapid response funding mechanisms in those three cases has been the setting up of pre-positioned funding at the outset, either of an annual period or of a shorter or longer period. But it's that pre-positioning which allows for the flexibility for organizations, as well as I touched on before, there is an element of intent and attitude, which so Christian Aid Ireland shared particularly on this in relation to the approach of Irish Aid and their response in Ukraine. Very briefly, Christian Aid Ireland, along with a series of other organisations, use an approach called surviving community-led response to support the actions and response of citizens, self-help groups, as well as local formal civil society. Those rely actually on group cash transfers. So cash mechanisms are actually one mechanism to consider in a otherwise restrictive legal framework. But also, as I said, in this case, it's actually under the rapid response funding mechanism. And the openness, both in terms of allowing for the accountability mechanisms developed by the self-help groups and local organisations themselves, as well as in terms of their setting the design of response and the programming cycle, as well as the evaluation, with the complementary facilitation support of the series of international and local NGOs, is what's really allowed for that kind of process to happen. The other, very much linked to that, is the appreciation of streamlined processes for reporting, which, again, the planned nature with the pre-positioned funding, there's the kind of initial evaluation of the NGO partner, and then one-page concept notes or two-page concept notes in the moment of application, which allows for extremely fast disbursement of funding, in some cases 36 hours, but up to about 2 or 3 weeks. And so these processes are really have been built on many years of negotiation and discussion, and sometimes involve very small amounts of funding, in fact. But what's really important here is the exponential impact that can have where effectively applied. I would just make one final comment, if I am allowed, which is to move us on a little bit to what we touched on before on anticipatory action funding. Now, I'll just make a couple of remarks here, which is to pose a question related, which Ralph posed, which is, is project or short-term funding better than the long-term? Well, the reality is that what we're seeing with anticipatory action is a kind of explosion in attention to this term and to the idea behind it. But for the moment, too much focus on pilots and ad hoc project approaches, as opposed to funding for longer-term anticipatory action, and also looking at the pooling of funding. And I'll just explain those 2 points before handing over. The importance of moving beyond a pilot 2 or 3 year approach is that period allows for building capacities and making the coordination links between forecasting agencies, national disaster management authorities, as well as local authorities and local NGOs. But what we're seeing for the vast majority of the situations is that then the lack in funding is for what in this sector they're calling fuel, but basically resourcing the early action plans that are developed by those organizations. So essentially we risk at the moment wasting the time of the organizations that we're engaging through this capacity building, because in the event of the crisis and the trigger being released, there is not the corresponding resourcing. So the positive solution, which is not an easy one, and this is where the grand bargain is a great sphere, actually, with the anticipatory action working group that's just been established, is for actors globally, for member states as well as NGOs to come together and look at what kind of global and regional pooled funding mechanisms can either be supported or created in order to pool the funding and pool the risk, which is essential to anticipatory action being more effective in practice.
Thank you very much, Ruth, and I'm actually glad that you brought up the question of anticipatory action, because this is something I would like to focus on right now in our debate. We reach now the point where I would like to talk a little bit more about possible ways how we can start closing the funding gap, and the anticipatory action is definitely one of them. And with this topic, I would like to turn now to Ralph, and would ask you, Ralph, if you can share with us your thoughts on that, but very briefly, because first we are running late, and secondly, I know that you have to leave soon for the board. So over to you.
Yes, many thanks, Jan, and many thanks for understanding. Unfortunately, my board is running since 4 p.m. and the delayed panel, I have to step out soon. More than happy to share one quick thought on anticipatory action, also from a personal angle. As a WFP director about 15 years ago, it started more and more booming with WFP, but many NGOs already really piloting it and being the front runners. And I think it's really an exciting tool and approach for two reasons mainly. One, we talk very much for good reasons about cost efficiency these days and how to decrease needs. Already in this period, I mentioned in the past, the first analysis came up that like if you do anticipatory action, which sometimes is mixed with preparations and preparatory action, etc., there is evidence that you can save 6 to 7 times of the funds you need for a belated response. Like if you provide what I mentioned before, if you provide the goods to the farmers who might be hit by a flood in a few weeks, and today we have the technology for all the early warning, for all the weather forecasts, etc. If you provide the aid, the funds, the supplies they need, and you take the opportunity to ask them still what they most urgently need, because you can still reach them, it's saving a lot of money, and it's much more cost efficient, and of course it's also more participatory and coming with much more dignity. And the other aspect really exciting about it from my view, and due to a lot of analysis, is also that it is coming, as slightly touched on before, it's in many ways coming with schemes which are really an agreement. And it's really an agreement between the affected populations, between the host governments, often shipping in, between sometimes insurance actors who commit to following on a prime they get before. They have to release funds in a given moment. And there are even some exciting regional funds by host governments, basically ensuring each other for the next upcoming drought. As everybody knows, it will be upcoming, and supporting each other by anticipatory action once the weather forecasts indicates the drought is coming, the flood is coming, and then providing the assistance much more in time, much more efficient, much more effective than if it's done only once everybody is in crisis and assessments needs to be done and the appeal machinery needs to start. So I think it's really exciting, and the commitment of some donors like Germany to invest in future at least 5% of their humanitarian funds for that, given that it's said that 20% of these emergencies, especially natural hazards, are possible to forecast today. That makes a lot of sense and really a big encouragement to step in from our more academic perspective. And I leave it with that. Many thanks for having me.
We thank you for being here with us on the panel, and we thank you for your insight, and I wish you a successful board. And
thanks so much. Have a good day.
And with that being said, I would like to address the last topic before we go to Q&A session. And it is still, on the subject of about the possible ways how to close a funding gap. So another possible way is bringing new institutional players in. So this will be my last question. And Michael, I asked the first question of this panel went for you, so the last one is also for you. And I'm asking you this question because I know that in 2022, DG ECHO has launched several pilot projects in cooperation with international financial institutions to test blended funding approach within a humanitarian response. So could you briefly tell us a little bit more about these projects, about the preliminary findings, and also perhaps more generally, where do you see the added value of these institutions in the humanitarian response? Over to you.
Yeah, the challenge is, dear Jan, to respond quickly and succinctly to
I know.
But I make a serious effort. I don't need to describe, of course, how big this funding gap is. We all know. And we also know that, according to all likelihood, this is going to become bigger, to grow. Problem is that when we look at the funding of humanitarian aid, we have only 3 forms of funding: grants, grants, and grants. And this hasn't really changed over the years. There are some pilots, for example, with insurance schemes when it comes to natural disaster prevention, for example. But if you compare the humanitarian experience with the experience of the development policy sector, many financial instruments that now have become part and parcel of the development portfolio have not yet been tried out in the humanitarian world. There are reasons for that, but at the same time, it's strange that we haven't really tried them out, because if it is true that in so many cases humanitarian aid acts in protracted situations, it's probably also true that some of the possibilities of raising funding that development colleagues are already trying out could perhaps be tried or could be adapted to the world of humanitarian aid. Now, there are many of them, like insurance solutions, like humanitarian debt swaps, for example, like humanitarian impact bonds and so forth. And some organizations have made experiences with that. But of course, in most cases, they need the support of a donor, because as soon as you leave the world of grants, if you go into, for example, debt solutions, blending solutions or whatever, there is an element of de-risking. You underwrite debt, and somebody needs to help you if there's a problem with paying back the debt. And that was one of the reasons why 2 years ago, ECHO started, we're continuing with this also next year, to finance a number of pilot projects. Actually, we have 2 tracks of pilot projects. Track 1 is our support to organizations that themselves then find an arrangement with a financial institution that can be either a development bank or it can be a commercial financial institution, in order to develop financial instruments that levy funding for the humanitarian sector. And therefore, we have launched projects, for example, with IRC and with the Danish Refugee Council for different projects in Jordan and Uganda, where development banks and private finances would put money into the sector. At the first and at the second humanitarian forum, European Humanitarian Forum in Brussels, we had panels with people from the financial industry. And I recently spoke to responsible members of the Luxembourg Stock Exchange. It is interesting that there is a market from the private investment angle. So private investors want to invest, for example, ethical forms of investment in the humanitarian sector. What is not yet there is an abundance of financial instruments, and what is not always there is this element of de-risking. There are, however, a number of areas where such financial instruments can be used. What comes to mind, for example, is camp infrastructure. For example, water pipes or energy solutions for long-term refugee camps. What comes to mind is investment in building preparedness or resilience against disasters. What comes to mind are, for example, livelihood projects that are income generating, where, for example, microcredits could be used. But the whole thing requires an adaptation of such techniques that have been developed in the development world to the humanitarian sector. And that means 2 things. First, we need to be much faster in our ability to mobilize such instruments. In the world of development, a good blending project that you would carry out with the World Bank or EBRD, the European Investment Bank or KfW, can take 3 years of preparation time. In the humanitarian world, we need to have something that is ready at the very latest after half a year, I would say. And the second thing is, of course, we need to ensure that there is a clear targeting on the people that are most in need. So not kind of an generic approach for an entire region, an entire province or whatever, but focus, for example, on refugees, focus on IDPs, focus on people who are really most in need. So we have also a second track where we are working directly with development partners. We had a very good project proposal in mind for Burkina Faso with the AFD in France. Unfortunately, due to the political developments in Burkina Faso, this project, which would have been camp infrastructure financing, has not yet seen the light of day. But we have now started also a project with the United Nations Capital Development Fund for blending solutions of a similar kind. So it's a bit too early to come with lessons learned because these projects are starting to be rolled out right now. And actually, as we speak, we are launching now with our new humanitarian implementation plans an invitation to financial operators and to implementing partners to come with proposals for the 2024 budget. So we want to select more pilot projects. And we can say at this moment in time already that yes, there is a market. Yes, there's interest. Yes, we can levy additional funding for the humanitarian sector. We can also say it will not be a panacea. It will not cover the funding gap. It may add 5 to 10% to the available amount of funding for the humanitarian sector. That is better than nothing, but it will not help us, so to say, to solve all the issues. And it also means that, of course, we probably need to have more time and sit down with the financial sector in order to really develop the products that we need for this kind of intervention. And therefore, in the grand bargain, we are starting with a new work stream. We are working together very closely with the World Economic Forum on that. And we try to work both on the readiness of donors, but also of financial institutions to offer this kind of product. This will be one of my main areas of activity in the next 3 years. I hope it will be successful. I would be very happy if it was, but at the same time, unfortunately, I do not see that this would be a solution once and for all for the financing problems of the humanitarian sector. For that, we need to have other measures. We need to shrink the needs if ever possible, and we need to have many more donors in the club.
Thank you very much, and that's for sure that we need many more donors, but unfortunately no one has a magical recipe how to create them. But so I think that we will have to work it a hard way. Anyways, our time is almost up, but I wouldn't like to finish this panel without giving you, the public, the possibility to ask one or two quick questions and to use the opportunity to have a direct interaction with the speakers on the panel. So the floor is yours now. So, yes, please. The mic is coming.
Thank you. Thank you so much for this really interesting and highly important panel. My name is Evelien van Roemburg. I'm from Oxfam EU. And I'm very happy that anticipatory action was mentioned because this is it's not an innovative topic. It's been around for many years, for decades. But we see that it's still not enough. It's still in its infancy. And I'm wondering why. So last year, Oxfam, together with Save the Children, published a report, Dangerous Delays 2. It was our second report about anticipatory action and how we are, again, not doing enough on this topic, whereas it is such an important tool to prepare, to make sure that people are resilient, that they have all the tools that they need in terms of when disaster strikes or when crisis strikes. So when we were talking to colleagues from Mr. Köhler last year about this report, and we said it's so important, the EU said, yes, we agree, it's so important. But my question is then why? Why is it not bigger? Why is there not more funding going to it? We just heard in the panel before that there was 50 billion euros that is going to the Ukraine facility, or at least the agreement is almost there. And I asked the colleague from DG NEAR, why is it possible that it's so much money in such short time? And he said it's political will. That's why we managed. So my question to Michael or to Thomas is, where is the political will on anticipatory action?
Okay, thank you. So I will first perhaps let Michael react quickly, and then Tomáš.
First, Evelyn is right. I think we all agree. Anticipatory action is absolutely key, and it is the right way to go. We may not always agree on what anticipatory action actually is. When I have discussions with other donors on this, I always come to the impression that we all agree to something, but which we define in different ways. But we do more. ECHO does definitely much more. It requires, however, that you are an expert and have instruments, including finance, in logistics. Part of anticipatory action is, of course, stockpiling in regions. Another part is to have the foresight. For example, we just had Hurricane Otis in Mexico. Acapulco and the neighboring region was very much hit. Mexico is an OECD member state, so they should have been prepared, but they were not. So with all the meteorological scientific evidence that you have, if you do not have the services, the civil protection services, the NGOs, the community resilience in place, the best stockpile doesn't help you a lot. We have, of course, stockpiles in Panama that can be flown in. But once they're flown into Mexico, then somebody needs to be there to do the work and to distribute that. So it's an entire organization. But I can confirm much more money is flowing into this. I think the argument of economics is very important. 80% of humanitarian spending these days goes into logistics. And if anticipatory action and the creation of reserve stocks, so to say, close to where disaster hits, helps us not only to be faster, but also to save money, this indirectly yields more money for humanitarian work. That's a very convincing argument. Now, it's not entirely fair to compare that with the possible future reconstruction facility for Ukraine, which, as you know, will be financed actually through debt by the member states of the European Union and other countries. And unfortunately, I think this is not something that the member states will do for humanitarian aid as such, but they may do it for the civil protection work. So starting with the disasters at home. And if that gives a convincing result, I think it will then also spill over on international work. So we need to have more success stories, and we are working on that. But indeed, it is true that, and there again, the Grand Bargain will do its work, that we bring together the community of people who are convinced by it and exchange cases of best practice so that we basically create a groundswell of conviction among policymakers that this is the way to do, this is the way to go. We have good examples, and now we should roll them out at a larger scale.
Thank you, Michael. And now the final word on the panel goes to you, Tomáš. Please tell us all about political will at Slovakia at this point, of course, in connection with the funding for humanitarian response.
Yes, thank you very much. It's definitely a very important question. And I'm happy that we were able to kind of quantify the early response, which would require anticipatory action, could be 6 times cheaper or 6 times more efficient. We absolutely do recognize that. I think from a very human perspective, why it is a bit hard? People don't like paying insurance, but then when the car is crashed, then you pay for the repair. Sometimes it's a bit hard to sell. I would say even politically and to the electorate, there's why are we doing something if there's nothing going on at the moment? So I think it's partly also human nature, but I do recognize that, and it's coming back to what I discussed before, that we need to be ready to respond. Because again, anticipatory action, as Michael, as you said, is sometimes it's a concept that's broad and not everybody picks the 100% of it in the same way. So I would say if we're talking about anticipatory action in terms of being prepared, having protocols, how we move, how we agree, how we make the decisions, how we distribute, so having standard procedures is definitely something that we can absolutely do. What I mentioned, the multi-year partnerships, that would also include the mechanisms on how to activate them quickly, what can be the triggers, who's going to decide on what, definitely can help. I would also say that for the small donors, this could in a way be a bit more tricky because all the pre-positioning, the logistics could be a bit more heavy for the smaller donors. But sharing experience, or maybe in a way getting this multiple smaller donors together to participate more in an anticipatory action could possibly be a way to go. But I can tell you that for me at the moment, Slovakia with its volume of funding, it could be a bit more tricky. But say Visegrad 4 countries get together and they start some kind of anticipatory action as a joint activity, I think it all of a sudden is starting to look a bit more realistic. So you have to also look at the size and the scope of the donor, which comes with expertise, economies of scale, etc., etc. So this definitely plays a role. But hey, joining forces together could work and make the thresholds lower to pass.
And with these words, we need to wrap up this panel. So I would like to first thank you, the distinguished speakers on the panel, for your insight. I would also like to thank the public for your interest and for your questions. And I apologize that we didn't have more time for the interaction. And I would just very briefly like to conclude with the words of Michael, who just said that we need more successful stories. Ruud has shared some successful stories with us today, and I hope that when we meet here next year, there will be more success stories to talk about. So with this, I thank you all, and I officially declare this panel finished. Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Well, thank you, Jan. Thank you, our esteemed panelists, and thank you as well. This was a very interesting discussion. I especially enjoyed the notion of we four countries getting together to be able to increase their funding and to deliver their funding in a more effective way. So before we wrap up the whole conference, we have to wait a few minutes for those participants that are at the Deep Talk on the second floor, just to give them enough time to come here so that we can all wrap it up together and hear the closing remarks. So please remain seated. We will continue in, I hope, 5 minutes to 5 minutes as soon as the others come here and join us.